a forester at NNRG, and over the last year, we did some work up in the Lake Whatcom area around Whatcom County. And during that work, we spent a lot of time thinking about forest management and during the extreme rain events, especially like the ones we just experienced a couple weeks ago. So that's sort of what this chat will be about. I have a couple slides to share, some pictures, some advice, and then maybe we can just open up to questions and see what people are interested in on that topic, since it was just so recent. Let me share my screen real quick and we will get going. All right. Does that look right, Lauren?
Whoops, I was muted. Yes, that looks great.
Great. Um, Great. So yeah, forest management and extreme rains. A couple of topics we'll cover, just like about those extreme rains, two problems that emerge when we're working in forests in the Northwest under those kind of precipitation loads. That's managing your forest roads and considerations of slope stability. And then just a little quick roundup of some tools and advice that forest owners might find useful in their own management of their forests. So, right off the bat, extreme rains probably on a lot of people's minds. It happened in the last month, pretty extremely across the Northwest. But for anyone that's lived here for a while, it's kind of a focus of our winters, are just sporadic winter storms. I grew up here. I grew up in a much rainier part of the state. And just a constant deluge of rain all winter, punctuated by these strong winter storms, or sometimes what we've taken to calling atmospheric rivers, like this image here on the slide, where moisture is being transported long distances. When I was a kid, I swear they used to call these the Pineapple Express. I don't know if anyone in the Northwest remembers that. Maybe that it was a different time. And then another rain event that we also talk about in Northwest forestry is rain on snow, when we rain right on top of a snow layer, which occurs quite a bit at our lower elevation locations, where the snow line fluctuates throughout the season, and particularly in the fall or the spring, you can get some pretty big rain on snow events. And depending on the duration and the intensity of these events, they can be pretty destabilizing to our forest operations, to forest roads, and just broadly to the natural slope stability of the region. So we'll kind of get into those effects. But also part of the reason we're talking about this is that there's emerging evidence that climate change will affect our rain patterns and lead to more atmospheric rivers and more rain on snow events as we shift into more wet winters instead of cold winters. And so likely planning for these type of rain events, while part of our life here for decades, is maybe only going to get more intense in the coming future. So let's see here. So that's a picture of an atmospheric river stretching all the way back to Hawaii. And then here's just a picture recently on Highway 2, where these floods can have pretty catastrophic consequences, as we saw. And I don't know if anyone here will want to share any stories from their forest at the end of the slides. Also, maybe at any point, if anything I'm saying doesn't make sense, just interrupt me. I really don't. This can be very informal. I threw together some slides, but I'm no professor, so just chime in if anything isn't adding up. So we've got a lot of rain that falls here, and the main impact of rain has to do with soil saturation. And maybe for some people, this is a known fact, but I learned this when I was in forestry school. Soils contain air and water in between their pores. Soil is really composed of air, water, and the soil stuff, the minerals and the organic matter. And the soil dries out or becomes saturated, and different amounts of water can be in between those pores. Eventually it gets so full of water that water runs out of the soil. So excess water leads to surface runoff when the soil can no longer absorb that much water. That's why intense rainfall events, the amount of rain per minute or hour can really matter. You can quickly saturate a soil's capacity to absorb and move a lot of water on the surface. And then saturated soils are just fundamentally weaker because they have less cohesion between their particles. And as we'll see, saturated soils are some of the reasons we have landslide events in the Northwest. So soil saturation drives what comes next, which is what we really all see, which is a lot of water moving around to different places. So the first problem with big rain events is really the forest roads. And forest roads are really helpful to implement forest management. They're necessary if you're trying to do any kind of harvesting where you're going to sell the wood you're cutting. But they're also really problematic, and you spend a lot of time trying to maintain them and keep them up to keep them well maintained because they have a great potential to cause problems, especially steep roads in high rainfall areas. So they're sort of a necessary evil of forest management, and we'll talk about how we can work with roads to be as safe as possible during these big rain events. But the primary reason why roads are cause issues during rain events is that they modify the natural hydrology and they intercept rain runoff. And so once the soil is saturated and flows are moving overland, the roads just cut through and intercept all of that runoff. And roads are designed with this in mind, and they have a lot of drainage control features, such as the road grade itself, the ditch that the grade puts the water into. The ditch then is dispersed through cross drains, water bars, and other features out onto the hillside. And the whole idea of a well-designed and maintained road is to intercept water, control its flow, and then position it safely downhill of the road. But this can be difficult, culverts, ditches fill in, culverts plug, road grades get degraded. And if we aren't on top of our road maintenance, we can quickly get a problem like in this picture where a ditch road has road water is not going into the ditch, but it's just flowing openly on the surface. Right now, this hasn't become a major problem, but it has every potential to. If I saw something like this out in the woods, I'd be very, very concerned that in just a few more storm events or even a few more hours, we could have a much more catastrophic blowout. And so maintaining your roads so that when water does start to get on them, it gets safely deposited downhill of the road is a big feature of a road maintenance plan. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. I'll just touch on another thing though. Roads, not only do they intercept water, but they also go over water. They cross streams and other natural hydrologies. And flooding streams can destroy these water crossings. And these are some of maybe the ones that get the most news attention because they destroy large sections of roadway. And that can be either because the water crossing, such as a culvert or a bridge, was undersized for the storm event, or more often it's because during these large storm events, large debris can be mobilized and plug up what otherwise is a really nice big 6-7 foot wide culvert, reducing its size really quickly and blowing out the culvert and the roadbed around it. So those are sort of the problems with forest roads and rain, but there's some options we can take to mitigate them. Here's a picture of just a more out of control. There's a water crossing that blew out where there used to be some kind of culvert. Now it's just a stream running across the road. Just an example. So what can we do? Forest roads and forest management. All landowners should be familiar with the roads that are on their property, both historic and modern roads. Historic roads are roads you may not be using any longer, and legally, roads that are before 1975 aren't even your legal obligation to maintain or change. They're considered orphaned roads by the state of Washington. But since 1975, Washington has regulated forest roads, and there's requirements that those roads be maintained to a modern standard to prevent the kind of catastrophic failures that we do occasionally see in big storms. And it's important to get a sense for your roads. Modern roads are designed fairly differently than a road from the 1930s. A lot of these old roads are just put in straight and right along a creek bed, where there's a real parallel likelihood of the road slipping into the creek. Whereas modern roads are designed to stay away from those water features as much as possible and have a lot more culverts and drainage systems. So they're since modern road designs have become implemented in the last 20, 30 years, forest roads have just gotten much safer than they used to be 50 to 100 years ago. Even then, a forest road that's properly designed and up to modern standards, has to be maintained to that standard. And that's something we see a lot with our clients, is just that it takes a lot of work to maintain those roads. We typically recommend driving them annually, coming up with a maintenance plan, checking your culverts and ditches to make sure towards the end of each summer, early fall, that the road and the road system is ready to handle, as it was designed for, the big winter storms that are going to come. And so having a maintenance plan can really help. And sometimes even the best designs, though, really may not be working well in practice. And that's where a really great recommendation, like my number one recommendation, is something called a storm patrol, which is the idea that a road looks very kind of safe and normal when it's dry and it's August, but go out on those roads during your big storm events. I mean, as long as you feel safe, and you will actually see the road performing, like it was designed to, moving gallons of water a minute. And you'll find where the road system is working, where the ditches and the cross drains are functioning well, and where they're not. And so not only will you learn how your system works, you'll be able to predict sort of where your trouble points are. Where do you need to really put that maintenance into? Not every mile of road is really the same. Most of the roadway is very innocuous, except for a few pinch points where you need to move a lot of water in a short period of time. And so you learn a lot about your road during a storm patrol. And it also, amazingly, so many road problems can be prevented by a couple well-placed shovels during a big storm. If a ditch is filled in and the water is back on the roadway, like a small creek running down your road, I have moved those back into the ditch with just a couple strokes of a shovel. So you can stop a really devastating event with just a couple well-placed actions. So those storm patrols, I think, are really effective and probably the single most important thing you can do during these big rain events, to make sure your system's up to snuff. As you go through event after event, you should gain confidence that as long as you maintain your maintenance, your system is ready to handle those storm loads. And here's a picture of this is a culvert that failed. You can see it, the water's pouring out from underneath the culvert. And in doing so, it washed away that whole bank and moved all of that sediment down into the probably lower stream section there. So not a great sediment outcome for our fish and other aquatic animals, and also really unstabilizes that road and needs to be repaired at big expense. If maybe some preventative maintenance had been taken here, it would be less expensive than it's going to be to fix this problem in this picture. Any questions so far on roads? Come up. Cool. So the other problem I wanted to talk about when it rains really heavily, and they're related, they're slightly different, but they kind of influence each other, is more broadly slope instability. And these are basically landslides. There are a lot of different types of landslides, shallow landslides, deep landslides, different ways that soil can slip. But it ultimately happens because the pressures on the soil are greater than its ability to resist. Um, and some of the factors that influence landslide risk are soil cohesion. Going back to that saturated image here, dry soil versus wet soil. Wet soil just doesn't have as much cohesion between the grains, the pores in the soil, and as a result, is much more prone to failure when wetted. Uh, but also the topography, the landform shape, and the slope angle are really important. Together, these kind of innate properties of a location are fixed. You can't really change soil properties, the size of the sand or the clay. Can't change the angle of the slope or the type of shape of the slope. So you just have locations on the forest landscape that are at a higher risk of landslides. On top of these kind of landform factors are another important factor, which is root cohesion. Mostly only in shallow slides, but roots can provide a lot of cohesion to hold an otherwise unstable soil bed together. And so maintaining root cohesion can be an important characteristic to prevent shallow slides. Now, deep slides are sort of a different beast and are so deep that roots have no real function on them. We'll show some pictures here of kind of the difference between shallow and deep landslides. And then, like I said, all of this is really, these landforms sit 99% of the year without any kind of concern. But when they get loaded with excessive water, the soils become saturated and heavy and poorly cohesed, then they trigger and you get these landslides. So that's sort of the problem of excess rains that can occur. And forest management interacts with this problem as well. And we have some decisions we can make to mitigate slope instability. I think I have a couple photos here. So here's an example of a bunch of shallow landslides from a 2009 atmospheric river up on Highway 12. And you can see that where there was a rain on snow. So there was snow followed by a lot of rain and in some locations, shallow landslides initiated and washed down and kind of covered the roadbed with soil. And so that's a shallow landslide, and you can see these are kind of initiated on either roads. Over here on the left looks like a road failure pretty clearly. On the right looks like it just initiated from a clear cut. So those are our shallow landslides, and those are the main ones that we can really mitigate the most and can plan for. There's also deep-seated landslides. So this is like the tragic Oso landslide recently occurred, and this is moved an enormous amount of material really quickly. And so those are deep-seated landslides as well, which forest management does have an impact on. They operate on sort of larger time scales, though. So a little bit on the slope instability, but what about our management and what are our options to work with this kind of natural fact? I mean, I do want to say the Northwest gets rained on all the time and has for thousands or millions of years, and landslides have been occurring as well for thousands or millions of years. So landslides are a natural function of the landscape. The question is usually, are they being triggered or are they becoming an additional risk because of an action humans are taking during forest operations? But geologists will tell you that so much of our lowlands have been formed by landslides and erosions. So they are natural features. It's just about not making them more likely to occur. And so what can we do in management to mitigate those risks? And first, just to reiterate the two ways in which forest operations or forest management affects the risk of slope stability is road drainage failures can be a really major culprit. Because if you fail to control your water, like culvert plugs and it overflows from the ditch and then goes down onto an unstable slope, you just added a lot of extra water to an unstable location, and that will likely, slip in those cases. So maintaining good road drainage is important, controlling that water and depositing it safely. on a low risk slope. And then the other risk is that reducing vegetation, and that's through logging, typically, but anything that reduces vegetation can lead to reduced root cohesion. Though the lag time is like 5 to 8 years after cutting down a tree. But those roots will eventually decay and cause less stability. And then also anytime you have reduced vegetation, even naturally occurring open areas in a forest, you have extra water loading from infiltration. There's just less vegetation using the water and intercepting it before it hits the ground. And so those are sort of our risks working with roads and managing the amount of forest operations and vegetation to avoid causing any kind of slope instability. The good news is that for the most part, like I mentioned, unstable slopes, kind of the best research on it currently indicates that they are pretty identifiable on the landscape. And here's an image over here of what the DNR considers to be unstable landforms. And the current Forest Practice Act requires avoiding completely all these unstable landforms. And 20, 30, or maybe 30 or 50 years ago, that wasn't the case. And people would clear cut right over inner gorges and convergent head walls. But through the rulemaking process, evidence has built up that these areas need to be avoided because they're just too unstable to operate on. So there's a whole set of landforms that the state considers unstable and truly just also seem to be the best research as well on the topic. So avoiding some of these steep slopes with convergent head walls and bedrock hollows. And so the solution here is simply just don't do any forest operations, don't build roads, and don't do any kind of logging or thinning on a location that might be unstable. Maintaining the vegetation on steep slopes really helps. And that's where thinning can be, if there's any kind of uncertainty about where these unstable landforms are, by thinning instead of completely clear cutting, you leave a lot of root stability behind to mitigate any kind of uncertainty. There isn't a lot of great research on the impact of thinning on slope stability. It's pretty clear that clear cutting reduces slope stability. But unfortunately, it just hasn't been studied at length. So we can sort of hypothesize, I think, that if you're leaving like half the trees and they continue to grow and occupy the root space left behind from the trees that were harvested, probably maintains pretty good slope stability. That's sort of my working hypothesis, is that thinning is a pretty safe activity to undertake because it leaves so much roots behind. But this is an ongoing area of study. The CMER process through the DNR rulemaking has 4 different studies currently under development and have been for the last 3 to 9 years, where they're doing some long-term studying and new modeling on this topic. So we're still learning stuff about how to manage slope instability during forest operations. Let's see if I think there's another picture here. Cool. But yeah, that is sort of the big overview of slope instability. Any questions on that before we drop into the sort of some tools and advice for people in their forest operation, forest management?
There's a question in the chat. Somebody asked, what is the suggested grade for forest roads?
Yeah. When I used the word grade, I was referring to the road prism having either an insloping and outsloping or a crowned grade to it. You may also be asking, how steep can a road be? I don't have an answer offhand on the percent grade. I know there is a requirement by the DNR on the maximum steepness of a road. We could look that up for you. But broadly, what's important when you're maintaining your roads after they've been built is they're designed with a very specific surface angle. Sometimes they shed water in to a ditch. Sometimes they slope out and there is no ditch. But most of the time they're crowned and do a little bit of both. And if you don't maintain your grade, typically by regrading with a grader or some other machinery, you'll get water stuck on the road, like in the ruts that develop. If you're seeing a lot of ruts, you've lost your road grade. Road grades, right, are only important on a road where you're managing the water flow, like a steep water. If you're like on a totally flat section of forest, there's not really much of a road grade. It would still be crowned to try to get water out of the ruts and maintain the road longer, but it has less of a function to. Without a good road grade, you could just get creeks running down your road, right? And so that's what the road grade functions for. But yeah, thanks for that question. Let me jump to my next slide here. So just wanted to overview some tools and advice for landowners or land managers. One that I really like is, or just, identifying these precipitation events. Of course, usually there's quite a lot of media attention to the atmospheric rivers and as they're coming. So I think if you just check the news, you'll have a sense when these events are coming at us. There's also a great tool from NOAA called the Seattle, Washington landslide thresholds. I got a picture of one over here. I'll drop a link in the chat. But these are just kind of simple metrics based on rainfall over the last 3 to 15 days. And they have determined sort of empirically that if a certain amount of rain falls in a certain amount of time, usually things get very unstable out in the woods. And so that red line in this image is the line of instability. And these shapes are at Seattle Boeing Field or Tacoma Narrows Airport, different rainfall gauges, and how close they're getting to this line shows you. I took this picture at the end of, I think, the atmospheric river, or maybe just another rain event, January 6th, here up in Everett. They were very close to exceeding this line, which is not a guarantee, but it's just sort of when I work with our clients, if I see any of the rainfall gauges start to push over this line, I like to remind everyone to, prepare a storm patrol or go, get ready. It's probably going to be a lot of rain that's going to tax your road system and perhaps add to some slope instability. There's a whole handful of these tools on a website, which I will link to in just a sec. So that's a helpful to kind of give you a sense when you should really be concerned, because we do get a lot of rain here, and if it's just slow, arduous, that kind of classic rain, that's not the concern, right? The soils can absorb or pass that slowly. It's when we get a high intensity rainfall event and the soils are already saturated from a previous or a longer duration of rain. The other thing I mentioned, road abandonment and maintenance planning. We talk about maintenance, right? Annual would be best. Checking on your worst spots or culverts that have been plugged in the past. I forgot to mention abandonment, road abandonment. Not all roads you have may be useful to you in the future. You may have inherited roads that have become hard to maintain. This we see a lot with clients, is that they've sort of neglected roads, let them become really overgrown, haven't checked their culverts in a long time. And if you don't intend to ever use that road, you should abandon them to the legal requirements, which would involve removing any kind of culverts and creating permanent water bars and really trying to make that road as future-proof as possible so that you can stop worrying about it once you decommission it. You can feel comfortable that it will be able to manage large storm flows in the future. So that's a great option if you are holding on to too many road assets that you can't keep on top of. But roads are really, really important. Before you do that, make sure you plan if you need one for an activity, a harvest. And so, abandonment planning is the process of determining which roads in your network of roads are useful to you. So I also recommend that. And then we talk about storm patrols. I think it's just really, really powerful to be able to see how your road system is moving water. Gives you great understanding about how ditches, road grades, ditches, culverts all work in tandem to safely move water in steep country. Um, Maintaining forest cover near unstable landforms. And then a lot of the time, it's best on if you have a unstable landform on your property, you're gonna likely either need to prove that it's stable or seek some geotechnical advice to prove that. A lot of people just avoid them entirely, but sometimes they're mapped inappropriately and you feel pretty confident that that's not an unstable landform. But if there's any kind of uncertainty around this, that they can be fairly high stakes, and it's best just to get some additional advice. It is unfortunately fairly expensive to hire a geotechnical report. And so for a lot of clients, it's typically better to either use some simple techniques to prove that the ground is safe or to avoid those landforms entirely. And that is, I think, my major sort of some highlights of advice. So just any questions for anyone has about forest roads, slope instability, extreme rain. Tell us how your road system fared in the last atmospheric river. Anything you learned last month or earlier this month.
Thanks a lot, Matthew. That was very interesting. How active is DNR or other state agencies in inspecting forest roads that were installed as part of a Forest Practice Act permit? After the harvest, how frequently does the state come back to inspect roads and whether they're being properly maintained?
That's a really good question. I do not know what legal answer there is. In reality, I find roads are only inspected during SPAs. I don't know though what the court legal answer is about if they have jurisdiction to check on that or not all road inspections. The whole way from your FPA on the haul road out is subject to a potential road review and road planning. So any like undersized culvert that you have to haul across, even if it's not where you are cutting trees, triggers potentially a review during that time. But yeah, great question. I do not know. But basically no one I've ever heard of really. Maybe an industrial landowner with a large land base, they submit road maintenance and abandonment plans to the state, and those are going to have very identifiable metrics that they should be meeting. But for our smaller landowners, I'm less certain about the timeliness of those or any review.
In the last 30 years, we've never been asked for DNR to come out.
Yeah.
Maybe they came out and found everything just satisfactory, but they've never mentioned it to us,
right?
Except during FPAs.
Yeah, the FPA, right? That's the nexus that I'm familiar with. But anyway, yeah, great answer. Thank you, Richard.
There's a question in the chat. Chris asked what material to use for a road, any type of soil or rock.
Well, it depends what you're doing with the road, but dirt roads are an option, but not very useful for hauling unless they're bone dry. And so if you're doing any kind of shoulder operations, most roads are going to be rocked with gravel. And then building a road involves sort of laying different size rocks down to establish first a road bed, maybe like with 2 to 4 inch rock or what's something called just pit run. And then you would finish with 2 inch minus or 1 3/4 minus. to add a surface layer with fine material. So I don't know if you ever bought gravel, but you can either buy clean gravel or with fines, the minus. So after you establish your road bed separate from the earth, then you finish it with like 1.75 inch minus. So it'll kind of fit into the bigger rocks and then has really small pieces that locks it all together. That would be sort of a textbook thing. The answer is, though, a lot of times it's just whatever rock you can get, because you're limited by the location of a quarry. Or if you're a larger landowner, most large landowners, get their rock or try to get their rock from their forest, because rocking a new road can be extremely expensive, and it depends on how far away they have to travel. Those costs can be really high. So probably not an option for most small landowners getting rock from their own site, but that's how most of the big folks are doing, bigger operations are trying to do it. And for our local landowners, yeah, if you're near a quarry, you can order the rock you need to set the road up. And then once you've set it, you will put periodic top dressing to maintain that road grade. That's my recommendation. If anyone has anything to add, some people maybe have maintained roads longer than me, have more of their favorite flavor of gravel.
Matthew, do you have any recommendations on resources that would list recommended tree and bush species for slope stabilization, say on the west side of the Cascades?
Well, for the purpose of slope stabilization,
Yeah.
I've not seen anything specified about that. We can sort of hypothesize. I mean, I actually think it's just better to have anything. So whatever will be easy to grow and maintain. I think I would focus first on the hardest problem often in reforestation is getting good planting success, managing browse pressure. I don't know that there's a huge difference in like rooting strength. There is differences in rooting depth and rooting size, but I think those concerns would be probably overshadowed by just what's most suitable to grow on the site, sort of our more general silvics around the species. And if you get a good coverage of any shrub or tree, I think you'll have achieved your root stability goals in that way. That'd be my advice. Yeah, your information on rooting depth is quite available. But yeah, west side, like, I don't know, the only one that came to mind as being really, really demonstrably different than the rest is juniper, but that's an east side species. But juniper has this extraordinary root width. Like most trees have a rooting width equal to their drip line or their crown width, sorry. But juniper can have it like 3 or 4 times its crown width. But that's not really a species at all suitable to the west side Cascades. But anyway, sorry.
There's a question in the chat. We asked, Clatsop County in Oregon allowed an unstable hill to be logged on county timberland prior to 1993, sliding into the Neelam in 1993. And it's still sliding today in 2025 with lots of bare soil on the hill. Is there any idea on where to start, or where to start on getting them to address the issue, the Clatsop County or OPRD?
Yeah. It's not something I know about, but I would go with, Oregon Department of Forestry, if I'm less familiar with their regulatory environment. But if this was in Washington, and there was an unstable slope and a nexus to a recent Forest Practice Act, there is a regulatory connection. I am less certain if 1993 statute of limitations, what kind of power the ODF would have. If it was in Washington and it was a couple years after your FPA, they could definitely blame you, and Washington DNR would get involved. I mean, sometimes I don't know what you can do to address it. I'm not a geotechnical expert, so sounds like a tough problem. That was a long time ago too, 32 years ago.
One thought that just came to mind, the Oso landslide that was so devastating, involved lots of litigation following. And the landowner had a logging operation at the kind of the brow of the hill that slid some years before the slide. And my vague recollection is that landowner ended up sharing some of the liability. So
They settled, so we never got the best science.
right,
A
but
German holding company.
yeah, the settlement though I think followed the filing of litigation. So
Yeah.
people were probably pretty aware, given the legal opinions they were getting on how the case would likely shake out. But anyway, research on all the ins and outs of that slide might be helpful for people evaluating other
Yeah,
slides to kind of get an idea of how liability is apportioned and what the state has done in the past and can do on enforcing regulations.
yeah, very good point. Yeah, that was a deep-seated landslide. And yeah, the kind of nexus that was alleged and seems pretty likely was, that, or it somehow involved the logging operation and the groundwater recharge zone back from the top of the hillside, which accelerated water infiltration. Um, I still hold it as an uncertainty, but it seems like, there's plenty of smoke coming from that direction. For some reason, I assumed the Clatsop County one was more of a shallow landslide, though. Sort of little stuff coming down. But in any case, yeah, there is legal ramifications for sure to a lot of this. Thanks for that link, Josh, on using vegetation for slope stability. That might have better information than what I was able to pull together.
Great.
Matthew, I have a question about trails. And I guess it would depend on the size of the trail, but have you noticed or seen anywhere an issue with trails, any kind of similarity to roads, or are they small enough that that's typically not something that is of concern?
No, trails have in abstract the same effect as roads, but they frequently just occupy less of a footprint on the landscape.
Mhm.
But yeah, trails can, especially poorly designed trails, move a lot of water because they have the same mechanism. They're intercepting natural flow patterns. What's nice about trails though is that it's really easy to build them to be sort of benign. If you build your trails to be outsloping, then you can really reduce how much water is captured. A problem with roads and why we don't build all roads as outsloping is because log trucks would then slide off the road in a wet or snowy winter, right? So there's a limit because of the way we use roads that isn't quite there in trail building, where we can have a lot more water bars because we're just using our legs, right, on these roads typically. So roads, I think, have more capacity to be less dangerous because, yeah, we can just put water bars and jogs, 90-degree turns, and the water goes off down the hill without a problem. But that is, building a good trail is something I'm only been around. I've never been in charge of. So not my expertise. I just know there's a lot of guides out there as well. I'm sure we could link to about maintaining good trails. But so much of this though is really like steep land, right? We want to be clear, like if you have a road or a trail on flat land, it's not going to intercept water in the same way. We're really talking about steeper terrain, where water flows under gravity through kind of the soil.
Um, We have
generally.
another question. Do you see the question?
Yeah. Question was, what can be used to capture some of the water that's draining in the ditch on the property to use water for later plantings, occasional use? Oh, you know, I only I don't have an answer so much for my forestry life, but more of my own like personal gardening passions. But in forestry, I would say that is not something I see really done. Um, right? Because there's a lot of water and it's like could be a risk. But the general idea is some kind of impoundment, right? Putting it into a holding dam, a series of holding dams. You'll see this like more commonly in the drier area. I think we take for granted how much water we have in the West or Western Cascades. But yeah, you could imagine some kind of impoundment design or system, and then that water would slowly flow through the soil later in the year. That'd be a great thing to brainstorm. A lot of what, limits soil productivity in our region is the availability of water during summer. And so if you can find a way to maintain more water in your soils during summer, that's great. I mean, the main one everyone talks about is increasing the organic material of your soil through kind of regenerative practices. The more organic matter you have in the soil, that is able to kind of act like a sponge and hold more water. But I don't think that's going to be able to hold nearly enough water as we're talking about coming down through these ditches. Um, but yeah, great question, Chris. What are you thinking would be useful on your property? If we got you here still, I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Hi. I don't know. I don't know. I just think that it'd be fun. We do have one drainage area that sort of accumulates a lot, but it's not retained or anything. It's just, but when you need it in the summer, it's not there. So I didn't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I feel like is Josh here? Josh works for the conservation district. He might actually have more information about building ponds.
Yeah.
Or he can defer as well.
I will definitely defer on that.
Okay, good. Yeah. I bet there's some good resources out there, a little outside of my normal forestry work, but great question.
Thank you.
Matthew, you mentioned that there are some like more simple low tech ways rather than hiring a person like a geotechnical specialist to come out to assess slope stability or anything like that. There are some more low tech ways to go about doing that. What are some of those low tech ways?
Yeah, I may have mischaracterized that. During the Forest Practice application, you you self-identify um, several questions. There's a whole kind of appendix, unstable slope appendix, and based on filling that out, you will either be good to operate or need to have a geotechnical report.
Mm.
So it's not so much like you can actually do anything differently. You just need to fill that out truthfully. And then it may be that the state determines that that you are safe to operate. Things you look for while you're in the woods that can be helpful to identifying these, since we want to identify them, is there sort of field markings of unstable landforms. Well, let's take a step back. First, many unstable landforms are, they're described in the rules. They're called rule identified landforms. When you hire a forester or you do your own Forest Practice Act, there's a whole checklist of things that you need to look for. A lot of unstable landforms are on slopes 65 to 70% or steeper. And so if you know what these inner gorges, convergent head walls, toes of deep-seated landslides, groundwater recharge zones, there's a whole list. If you familiar yourselves with the list, then you'll be able, when you walk your forest, ask yourself, does this seem like one of those unstable landforms? Some of the field markings of unstable landform are things like cracks in the earth where the land has slid, scars from past landslides, or maybe a bunch of alder that looks like it's 10 or 20 years old, surrounded by 100-year-old Doug fir, and it's on a bank. And you could presume with a little more investigation that there would have been some kind of slope failure there in the past. Another one is called pistol-butted trees, and these are trees that grow crooked out of their base, and that can happen a few ways naturally, so it's not 100% causal by any means, but it also can occur when the slope has slid underneath a tree, and the tree accommodates that by changing its angle of growth. And so if you're seeing ground cracks, if you're seeing past landslides, if you're seeing pistol butting, these are all signs of instability. In addition, a lot of landslides have been mapped by the DNR Geologic Survey, and there's a great resource online to look at landslide, to look at slopes. They won't ever, and certainly not since the OSO era, say what is stable or unstable, but they provide some resources so that you can educate yourself about what could be out there. There was just a Seattle Times article about this. They are making progress, but still many years away from mapping all of the historic landslides in the state of Washington.
A steep slope versus like a mid slope or a not very high at all slope. Like, what is there a specific degree?
Degree, yeah. About 65% is where 65% slope, right? So that is rise over run. But yeah, most of the unstable landforms occur on slopes 65% or over. That's currently the state of the science. I mean, that question is actually just being interrogated again in a recent SEMR report, which I'm been waiting for the last year for it to be released. But yeah, that's currently the thinking, 65%, 70%. Those are the kind of slopes where kind of the gravity is overcoming the strength of the soil to hold together, right? And you rarely get any movement in a 0, 10% slope because the gravity is pushing down into the earth, right? Instead of down the slope. So.
Do issues, I know you said it's mostly 65% or over, but do you ever see issues on like 30% slopes or kind of something that is surprisingly not as steep?
Yeah, there are still, this is where it's under investigation for all of the work that has gone into identifying unstable landforms. There are still sort of unexpected, they're not big, right? Like these aren't the big ones. There's small shallow landslides that sometimes just occur in places people don't predict. I don't know how many, but it's something like the great majority are captured well by these major landforms, which are sort of like no-brainers once you spend enough time there. But it is, science is still working. They have not identified every little factor that could release soil. But one that occurs also is, like I said, a human trigger, like a failed road drainage system could saturate a soil way past its holding capacity, right? And then you could have a failure occur maybe on a soil that's not quite as steep. But yeah, interesting question. I am waiting. I've been waiting for they're like a year behind schedule. I hope they release some of these reports soon.
And who did you say those reports are coming from?
It's from the DNR's Adaptive Management Program, CMER. I forget what that one stands for. Let me pull it up here, SEMR dashboard. See if I can find that for you real quick. Yeah, AMP dashboard. So this is just another resource. This just sort of tracks the, I don't know, dozen different research projects that are always have been for the last, I don't know, since 1998. This process of adjusting the rules to best reflect the evidence.
Okay. Oh, that's cool.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everyone for your time. It was a real pleasure, and hope you enjoyed yourself.